I've been reading up on this phenomenon of oversleeping, hypersomnia. Apparently affects 4 to 6% of the general population, which is far more than I would have thought before I started reading into this. And they need a minimum of, the base rate is they need a minimum of 10 and a maximum of 12 to be even minimally functional, which again I underestimated before I started reading up on this stuff. And I got into it because I'm having the opposite problem. I wish I had that problem. That's how bad it's been with me. I'm having the sleep for 4-hour stops and wake up, even on days where I've got nothing to wake up for, my days off, where usually it would be the case that I'd just be stressed just knowing the fact that I have to wake up and go to work, and that would wake me up well before I would need to be woken up by the alarm clock. And so consecutive hours, enough consecutive hours of sleep for me is something of a rarity nowadays. If I get over 4 hours, I am extremely lucky, whether it's my days off or whether it's a work day. So that prompted me to start reading up on the phenomenon of hypersomnia. Eventually, it doesn't take long for me to detour when I start researching the subject. The next thing I know, I got like 15 tabs open with topics loosely related to the initial research project. It's horrible. I'm way too easily distracted, but it's also a bit of a virtue, conceptual virtue, because I'm just interested in that many things. But yeah, 4 to 6% of the general population globally, that's a hell of a lot of people, and you got to think, it gets into the subject of the normative status of dreams, because the more you sleep, odds are, the more you're going to dream, and dream more intensely. So we're not just getting into some sort of dreams that are meh, but we're probably going to get into nightmarish dreams and some of the best dreams one could possibly have. Which is, again, in philosophical literature, I find that dreams are so under-discussed. The closest thing to discussions about dreamlike states are these discussions that you had in about early 70s onwards, where Robert Nozick invoked the experience machine to argue, as he put it, against utilitarianism, but really what he was arguing against was hedonic standards of well-being, bordering on welfarist standards of well-being. And really, from what I've read, that's about the closest philosophers had gotten to having sustained discussions about dreams and dreamlike states and the normative status of those sorts of things. And given how many people suffer from hypersomnia, I actually think this is far more of a consequential discussion than I would have figured before I started reading up on this sort of stuff. Because suppose these people who have it really bad, who need to sleep 12 hours a day, and those aren't even the worst cases, that's just the kind of the average within the worst case, but I would imagine that the worst cases would have to be above 12 hours, 13, 14. And if they're lucid dreamers, then you got to think that it could be said of them that they spend half of their lives, if this is something that they haven't been able to curb, that there are at least some people in the world who spend maybe almost half of their lives, definitely over a third of their lives, dreaming. And imagine that it's the case where, certainly with me, if I sleep for more than 10 hours, which I can't remember the last time that's happened, where I just consecutively 10 hours of sleeping, but on the few occasions that has happened, those have been the few occasions where I actually dreamt something really bad or really good. See, January 1st, you'd think New Year's Day, and I could set aside some time for video making without a single siren. And look, it's getting worse now. It's so distracting because not only do I start thinking about the siren, but then I start thinking about the fact that I'm thinking about the fact that I'm thinking about the siren. And it's just this infinite loop. And I thought New Year's Day, but that's actually very dumb now that I think about it, because of course New Year's Day you're going to have a bunch of people who overdosed last night and did a whole bunch of other crap because the calendar told them they had to be festive. Every time I defend my calendar nihilism, people immediately assume that I'm against festivities and being joyous and against celebrations. That's not the case. I'm just against doing it on non-circumstantial grounds, on these contrived grounds, because you have reverence for the stupid calendar. I'm all for festivities when the circumstance calls for it. But of course, I forget that people don't operate the way I do. So because the calendar says it's December 31st, they feel they need to go get shit-faced. And so then even on January 1st, I can't enjoy peace and quiet for long enough. Okay. End of siren rant portion of the video. If another one goes off, I'll try not to indulge in a rant again about it, but it's very hard. Because this sort of shit happens more frequently, and it shouldn't happen at all on a stat holiday. But that's my idealism again. Because of course you got a bunch of people who did God knows what last night. Just returning this morning from work, I saw more crap on the floor and more bad crap in the way of syringes and... Okay, I said I was done with that portion. Let's return to the dreams. So you have these people who plausibly spend definitely over a third of their lives dreaming if they need to sleep, if they need to average more than 12 hours a day asleep, and perhaps the worst of them might actually, it could actually be a factual statement that they spend half their lives dreaming something. And when I think about myself, I know that the times where I dream intensely are those days where it's something like in the double digits of number of hours slept consecutively. Doesn't happen often, didn't even happen often back in the day, but the few times it did happen, there was a strong correlation to that. And so, philosophically, it's such an under-discussed subject. Can it be said of the people who spend that much time dreaming that the dream states, whatever might be good and bad about their lives consciously, the inputs, outputs that they experience, or in terms of desire realization, aversion realization, preference satisfaction, preference frustration, or on some objective list theory account of what makes a person's life go badly or well, that sort of threefold, triple threat dispute that it's never going to be solved, apparently, because philosophers just can't form a strong enough consensus of one of those three big theories. But whatever might be said about how their lives go from that waking hour conscious measure, you could have someone who dreams nothing but the most horrible nightmares and have that be the defeater in terms of whether or not their life was worth living, even if by the standard theories that only take the conscious moments into account, you would have said that person's life was one of the best lives ever. Would that be something that is plausible enough, where the dream states can count as a defeater as to whether or not a person's life went unacceptably well, unacceptably badly I mean, or acceptably well? I think it very much is the case. And the real big problem with what Nozick did to, I think, almost kneecap this discussion, where it could have actually gotten off the ground, but it didn't, because I can almost see the preemptive strike against it being associated with the experience machine. Nozick didn't discuss this in adequate enough detail, and the people who responded to him in an attempt to justify the experience machine, those were all strictly hedonists, proponents of these hedonic theories of well-being, where positive and negative valence is just the entire story. And minimal gain in terms of positive valence would be enough to outweigh any amount of non-hedonic, non-valenced bad thing that these other non-hedonic theories would definitely take seriously. A bad thing like perhaps your worst fear coming to fruition without you necessarily realizing it. Like a person who, for instance, spent their whole life trying to get famous, trying to reach some sort of notoriety, never managed to do so, died, and then the next day something they did went viral. Right? So on the hedonic account, we can't say that that person's life went better, because the moment they're dead, their life can't go well or badly whatsoever. On the desire satisfaction account, preferentism, or the objective list theory account, plausibly, that absolutely is something. If you build fame or notoriety or popularity into an objective, one of these objective things that make your life go better. And in the desire satisfaction account, if you desire fame and notoriety and things of that sort. The time at which it is realized is irrelevant. All that matters is that that thing is, in fact, realized at some point. It can happen the day after you're dead, a year, a century, a millennium. It doesn't matter. As long as it is realized, it does make your life go better, even post-mortem. Very unintuitive, but it has been defended, and defended to the point where I'm willing to sign up for it and defend it further if need be. But see, the problem is the non-hedonic theories are too... I had the term for this, but now I can't think of it. I'll just use the word flippant. They're too flippant when it comes to hedonic criteria, just as hedonic criteria is too flippant when it comes to anything that's non-hedonic. So ultimately the debate turns on what's referred to, there's actually only one paper that I found discussing this, but it turns on what's called welfare invariabilism versus welfare variabilism. Right? So the variabilist says that there's more than one theory that can be true in terms of what makes a life go better and worse, and it really depends on what type of moral patient we're talking about, what kind of subject we're talking about. That's welfare variabilism, and welfare invariabilism is simply the denial of that. These are not well-known terms whatsoever, probably even terms like preferentism and objective list theory aren't well known, but nonetheless, they need to be discussed. And so it does tie back into dreams, because I think if we're willing to admit that these people who dream a whole hell of a lot, and even people who might not dream that much, we can still say that, suppose that it's just objectively true that the average person spends 20% of their life in a dream state. Are we going to entirely exclude that 20% as counting, as making up 1/5 of how their lives go, simply because it is a subconscious state? And see, that's what it means for a non-hedonic theory to be too flippantly exclusionary when it comes to hedonic criteria. And so if I made the ultimate case as to why dreams ought to be taken seriously, to the point where they could even be defeaters in terms of justifying a life, saying that a life is, on these objective grounds, good enough or unacceptably bad because it just had that many good or bad dreams that accompanied the stuff that the person experienced or had realized while they were conscious, then we can absolutely export that sort of stuff to the arguments in terms of the experience machine. The experience machine is dismissed wholesale simply because it is ultimately a debate against paternalism. So it's not the decision of the subject, it's the decision of the bystander who wanted to, absent the subject's own consent, just insert them into that experience machine. That's certainly where the objection was taken later on. Initially it was presented simply as this judgment-sensitive affair where Nozick draws on the commonsensical response, and he says, well, you wouldn't inject yourself into that sort of experience machine, knowing that you can't, once you're in it, you can't get yourself out of it, and even if it contained these optimally blissful experiences, eudaimonic experiences, they wouldn't be real experiences, and you would end up cutting short all these real things, real relationships, real life projects, real pursuits, real ambitions that you have. You would have to just cut them off simply to experience these non-real, but nonetheless truly pleasant, valenced states. Now, as far as I know, there were no actual surveys that tested people to see whether this is truly as commonsensical as a lot of philosophers assumed. A couple of Q&As in philosophy seminars don't make for longitudinal surveys, so we can actually see whether that is in fact what the average person would say. But yeah, from what I recall, in the philosophy seminar, when the professor asks the students, most students say, no, I would not plug into the machine, insofar as plugging in means I can't plug out once I'm in, because I want to maintain, I need, my actual life needs to have this continuity. It needs to have that sort of arc. There's an aesthetic to that arc, and I don't want to give that aesthetic up by remaining for the rest of my life in this non-real state. in the experience machine. But you tune the dial just a little bit in terms of that kind of a response, and you just say, well, assume you were in the matrix, actually, or whatever, some sort of Cartesian demon adjusted matrix. There have been a lot of these over the ages. Would you want to unplug from that into some sort of great unknown where you have no idea just how bad things would be? All we can tell you right now is the sort of simulation, the sort of simulated bliss that the experience machine has been presented as from the get-go. Just assume that we gave you incontrovertible proof that that actually is this life that you thought was your organic life, this emergent property as your life. That's actually the simulation. Would you unplug and enter the great unknown? And see, in that case, the students who've been asked overwhelmingly say, no, in that case, I would stay within the simulation. So that's a bit of an intuition pump that suggests a lot of status quo bias in terms of what people think ultimately matters for how their lives go. And certainly that status quo bias needs to be attacked a lot more in philosophy and dare I say, outside of philosophy. And so not only can we justify dreams as things that not only can marginally worsen or improve one's life, depending on how they go in the aggregate for the individual, but ultimately the wisdom of plugging into the experience machine itself, and even the morality of plugging another individual into it, at least when we build it into their preference set, assuming they have these rationally ordered preferences. Now, a lot of people don't, so someone can come along and say that they prefer A to B and B to C and C to D, and then if I catch them in some sort of circumstance saying that they prefer D to A, well, I try to explain to them that actually, no, that makes no sense based on this other ordering of your preferences that you've been pretty clear about, right? You've actually told me, you've articulated what is your preference architecture. And you've contradicted it right then and there. And for what? Because of some sort of, when people do this, what distorts their thinking is usually something in the way of envy, something in the way of clout chasing, something very interpersonal that just bamboozles them into contradicting an otherwise perfectly stable preference architecture that they've sorted out for themselves. And so in that sort of a scenario, just as you would if someone's about to drink bleach and you try to tell them, hey, dude, that's bleach. You don't want to drink that. You're going to end up just not having a good time and probably dying if you gulp down a big enough chunk of it. And they, for whatever reason, inexplicably, they just don't believe you, and you see them going for the chug, and you just run up to them and you just smash it out of their hands. That is a paternalistic move, but you have every reason to believe that that sort of person will go on to thank you for it because they didn't want to die, and they simply wanted to drink the bleach because they were misinformed. Likewise, if you have equal amount of reason to believe that a person who chooses not to plug themselves into an experience machine stems from that sort of whatever it is that's clouding their judgment in the moment, you have all the reason in the world to believe that yes, they don't want to step into the experience machine at T1, but I'm gonna give them the little tug and set them in there, and at T2, even though they will not have the option to step back out and rejoin the real world, nonetheless, they will come to appreciate it. Now, however much time passes between T1 and T2, maybe that's the sticking point. Ultimately, I believe it doesn't matter. Just as I believe it doesn't matter, this kind of paternalistic meddlesomeness and interference should not matter when it comes to one's present self and one's future self, to the extent that we can all agree that one's future self is wiser than one's present self. This is probably the only way parenthood can be justified, is if the parents, more often than not, do stuff that's in line with the minor's future ideally rational self compared to their present self. There's no other standard that justifies that. So all these arguments about the central importance of autonomy in moral philosophy, and even to some extent in political philosophy, is a misfire in my view, because, well, number one, what it has to do is it just has to divide all agents, right? So there are agents 18 and over, of whom it can be said, well, it's totally impermissible to violate their autonomy, to show them that kind of lack of respect, and the lack of respect for their rational capacities, even in cases where we can definitively show that by acting in ways that constrain their autonomy at T1, we will have improved their lives and perhaps even gotten them to admit later on at T2, T3, whenever, to admit that they're glad that that has been done, even though it was done absent their consent at T1. We can't be flippant about this. We can't make it into policies, but abstractly, purely in terms of conceptual analysis, we can clearly see that the only barrier to that is a belief that it's perfectly justifiable to do that to agents under 18, and there's some kind of magic that happens when the clock strikes midnight on one's 18th birthday or 21st birthday, however you want to split that difference. There's some sort of autonomous magic that kicks in because they don't treat it as a threshold concept in philosophy. They draw these, in certain kind of Kantian and other traditional moral philosophies that associate autonomy and dignity in these ways that I never would, they all have to draw distinctions between minors and adults and draw a line somewhere. Not a line. A line obviously has to be drawn, but they don't understand of that. They don't conceive of that line in practical grounds. They conceive of it in these sharp normative grounds. And in my experience, they don't treat it as a threshold concept. It's like an on and off switch. So the same sort of mistake people make when it comes to treating beliefs as I believe this and I disbelieve that, like it's beliefs as this on and off switch. No, it's about credence levels and assigning probabilities to the likelihood of this or that thing being true, well-founded, or untrue and unwarranted. So autonomy, if it's understood in this sort of way, and loops into other rhetorical, just pretty much saying autonomy in different ways, like self-ownership, sovereignty. Sovereignty, fair enough, you want to talk about nations, that's where the word sovereignty should be used, but people use it in moral philosophy to refer to individuals. Self-determination, agency often crops up here, to say that it is morally impermissible when you have every reason in the world to make someone better off by violating their autonomy at the moment. If you truly do believe that, you're going to have to tell me what justifies compulsory schooling, for instance. If you understand that you can't draw the sharp line between agents 18 and over and under 18. What justifies compulsory schooling, and a whole host of other things, curfews. There's a whole number of things that, like, even I wouldn't say are justified, even though I'm making the inverse case. Because there's no evidence that the child's future self will actually come to appreciate it, but we still mindlessly just accept it. You're going to have to tell me what justifies stuff like that, and you're also going to have to tell me what justifies in this simplistic case, admittedly simplistic case that I came up with, talking about someone who's about to drink bleach, hears you out, sees that you're yelling at them at the top of your lungs that they ought to not drink this bleach. For some reason, they simply don't believe you that it's bleach, and you know they don't want to die. And you not only run up to them and smack the can out of their hand, but let's say it has to be some sort of a struggle. So you're both struggling to get the can out of his hand, and you maybe kind of have to, wrestle him to the ground and get him in an arm bar, and then you finally get the can out of their hand, and you pour it down, and then he sees bleach. I was like, holy crap, thank you so much. But you've done this horrible thing to him by constraining him and wrestling him to the ground. And we can get more animated about the lengths to which a person can go to benefit someone. So there's a paper called Beneficence versus Autonomy that I'm going to link to because it makes this point. It reaches the conclusion I want to reach, but in a comprehensive way. But one thing that the author of that paper doesn't go into is dreams, and how intuitively bizarre it would be if we just said a person who dreams nothing but nightmares, and they don't even have to dream that much, but to the extent that they dream anything at all, it's always nightmares. Let's say that it's less than 10% of their life, but it's strictly speaking nightmares. Just so bizarre to assume that if there's another individual that's identical to them in all these other respects that have to do with achievement and accomplishment and what they experience and what they perceive from the waking hours, purely conscious portions of their lives. And when we start comparing those two people, even though they're identical, they're essentially replicas in terms of how their conscious lives go for them. The first one I introduced dreams nothing but nightmares. The second one has nothing but euphoric dreams. And likewise spends an identical number of hours dreaming as the person who dreams nothing but horribly, but it's not a especially large percent of their life. It can be as little as 1% of their life. So these people can both spend as little as 1% of their life dreaming these terrible and euphoric things, and their lives can be purely indistinguishable from the waking hours comparative standpoint. It would still be bizarre to say that all things considered, their lives were in fact evaluatively identical, and to discount the 1% where the differential was humongous, even though it made up just 1%. It would truly be implausible and indefensible. And yet, earlier I said that there's scant discussion in philosophy when it comes to dreams. It actually has been discussed, it just hasn't been discussed in the domains of philosophy that I find most interesting. It's been fairly frequently discussed in philosophy of mind, it's been discussed in ontology, so the question, what is the ontological status of dreams? Well, philosophers have devoted a significant amount of time to that question, but when it comes to the evaluative stuff, I haven't seen nearly as much discussion on it, sustained discussion on it, like full-blown papers being exchanged back and forth between the heavy hitters in analytical philosophy. That certainly has been the stuff I was referring to earlier on in the first clip. I did get interrupted, so now I'm continuing this on a separate day because I wanted to spare you a second rant about the siren, which I promised I would spare you in case I indulged in it, and so I did. And the moment I started ranting about it, I stopped and figured I just need to do this on a separate day. So I watched what I recorded back in the first 25 whatever minutes of the recording. I watched that back and I'm broadly satisfied with it, but I still, because I know that I touched on paternalism, and so really it's a roundabout argument in favor of paternalistic assent, as oxymoronic as that may sound. When you understand autonomy in this stringent way that I've talked about autonomy in the first 25 minutes of the video, when you have that understanding of autonomy where your autonomous good can come into conflict with your ideally rational preferences or just lifetime adjusted preferences. In common parlance, people speak of autonomy as something that is pretty much interchangeable with global preferences of the individual, and so they associate autonomy with individual liberty and certainly with negative liberty, but there are certain tensions when you start thinking about the adjustability of preferences and the intra-individual fungibility of preferences. And because I didn't really cover that in much detail, I just assumed that everyone's going to have this view of autonomy that I do, because I read the way philosophers write about it, what a stringent concept it is. Most people really don't appreciate how protecting one's autonomy can easily violate one's global preferences, because what you prefer at T1 is not necessarily going to be identical to what you prefer at T2. And so because of that, I can't just say paternalism. I have to go to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy and just read the conceptual issues within paternalism, because past the introduction stage, they go 2.1, hard versus soft paternalism. I didn't discuss that in a granular fashion. Broad versus narrow paternalism, weak versus strong paternalism, pure versus impure paternalism, and then finally, moral versus welfare paternalism. So there's all these different ways through which we can split paternalism into different variants, and the autonomy purists are those who would rebuke even soft paternalism, even narrow paternalism, and even the impure versions of paternalism, which I think absolutely, they err when they try to make those kinds of arguments, because it just gets further and further away from welfarism. And welfarism, with the world as it actually is right now, should be of utmost importance. And that's why I'm just having the salience of dreams, and it's not exactly salient in a lot of autonomy-infused moral philosophy. And it can't possibly be, because the only way you can truly be wronged is if your autonomy is wronged, setting it entirely apart from your preference architecture. And to the extent that autonomy matters in these legalistic, constitutional contexts, broadly political contexts, it matters because the average bureaucrat is just going to be worse in terms of predicting for your global preferences than you are, based on my admittedly not exactly thoroughgoing engagement with the literature on that sort of stuff, but now my modest engagement with that sort of literature. But see, that doesn't mean we draw these hard and fast distinctions. We err to being concerned about autonomy as a rule consequentialist type of thing, just like we err on the side of having respect for the law, not because the law has any sort of intrinsic importance built into it, but as a rule consequentialist framework for maintaining stability. The same sort of story can be said about why it matters, why autonomy is a word that we shouldn't entirely discard. But I absolutely do want to relax certain distinctions. I don't want to collapse them, but I do want to relax them, because I think there are certainly some openings where paternalistic meddlesomeness can be justified. The seatbelt law debate. There's a New York Times article from 1984 where people were presenting the introduction of these seatbelt laws the way that a lot of other things have been presented right now, as in it's the opening door to that's how you get on the sort of slippery slope, is you just allow for these kinds of seemingly trivial paternalistic points of beneficence and even harm prevention, and then next thing you know, it's going to snowball into something truly draconian. And then people just forget the fact that they've cried this sort of wolf numerous times in the past, even the New York Times in the mid-'80s, and it didn't spiral into anything catastrophic or anything remotely close to catastrophic. So that's a lazy objection. It's the lousiest of all the objections, is the slippery slope, because we're always on the slope. We're on the slope every time we revoke a law, every time we deregulate something. You can view that as a kind of slope toward lawlessness and chaos. Because technically, yes, it means one fewer law. And no one recognizes it that way, even though strictly speaking, it is true. But people are very keen to fret about the slope when it's one extra law, when it's one extra regulation, as a slippery slope toward the tyrannical end of the opposite spectrum. And so that's just another kind of status quo bias that's very entrenched. It's probably not going away anytime soon. But what's the counter to that? I mean, the slope works both ways: lawlessness and tyranny. And yet, if it's on anyone's mind, it's always going to be on people's mind in the direction of the tyrannical end of things. Even though when you ask them point blank, is lawlessness really that much better than tyranny? A Lord of the Flies style society, is it really that much better than a tyrannical society? Maybe some people will say, well, tyranny is a 10 out of 10 level bad, but lawlessness, it's not that far behind. Could be a 9 out of 10, 8 out of 10 level bad. And so to the extent that you are somewhat rightly concerned about the prospect of lawlessness, then you should recognize that these slope arguments, the slipperiness works both ways. So the last thing I want to point out, because as I was talking in the first clip, I flew by so much that you can't just fly by it in terms of quickly referencing it, because I referenced the one's present self and then one's future self, and I'm talking about the future self as the ideally rational self, or at least something approximating the ideally rational self. The wiser self, right? But assume it's not just somewhat wiser, assume that your future self is actually your ideally rational self, as rational as your rational capacities would allow you to be, in terms of you having some sort of limits. You're not omnipercipient, but as rational as you can possibly be, you, a decade from now, let's say, actually reaches your apex. And so let's just say we duplicated you, and you're identical in all these respects, physiological respects, anatomical respects, but not psychologically. Psychologically, you have reached the apex of your innate capacities. And it's yourself from the future, but for the sake of the thought experiment, you have invoked yourself from the future right now, and you have this option that you can sell yourself into slavery. Very risky discussion, but I'm going to broach it. You can sell yourself into slavery to no one else other than your future, ideally rational self. So there's no interpersonal dimension that's being invoked here. It's strictly speaking intrapersonal, but it's an extravagant circumstance. It's not a circumstance that lends itself to any sort of practical discussion, admittedly, but that doesn't make it uninteresting. It's weighing on my mind quite considerably as of late, the more I read about these distinctions within paternalism, and knowing that there's no way to rule out soft paternalism, narrow paternalism, impure paternalism on first blush, the other ones being arguable. And just given how many of these zigzags exist within the history of philosophical discussion on paternalism proper, I actually do think that this age-old dangerous question about selling oneself into slavery, it should be off limits the moment we're talking about selling yourself to a separate individual, even if it's the individual you trust more than anyone else. The possibility of betrayal still lurks there. But unless you're some sort of a masochist, the prospect of selling yourself into slavery to your future, ideally rational self, the fact that people will just balk even at that, I would answer yes to that, because I see all the ways in which I am, when it comes to at least practical rationality, irrational. Not even because of what I believe or disbelieve. So not as a doxastic operator, but just in terms of what I do. Right? My increased rationality from the armchair standpoint has not translated to behavioral rationality. I touched on this in my video, Deserved Restorativism, but I'm going to go into it a bit further because it does hinder me in many ways. Right? You'd think that the more rational you become in terms of apprehending texts, apprehending all these purely conceptual issues, it'll translate at least somewhat to more rationality day to day, right? So you got stuff you understand in the cold light of day. Well, it's got to translate somewhat to you understanding more in the heat of the moment. It just hasn't been the case with me. In fact, I think that behaviorally, I may have gotten a little more irrational as time has gone on, because I just catch myself in certain kinds of task-based funks that I don't think plagued me back in the day when I was far less rational and far less learned from the armchair standpoint. So it's just this weird asymmetry. And if the solution to that clearly is just selling myself into slavery to not some other person, but my future self, who can, in cases where I really don't want to do something, actually force me to do it because they own me legally, that's not a frightening prospect, because I actually trust myself. See, a person who doesn't actually deep down trust themselves to maintain their own welfare over the course of their entire life, they would find it hard to trust their future ideally rational self, to the point where they'd be willing to sell themselves to slavery to such a person. I wouldn't. I do not hesitate about me in the past or me in the future in that respect. I don't hesitate whatsoever. That's the one thing where a human-to-human style interaction does not. That's the one area in which that's the one area where a human-to-human interaction does not leave me raising my eyebrow. A human-to-human interaction entailing that much in terms of my own interests But see, there's another problem here, is because people will use the word freedom. Well, you're still constraining your own freedom, even if you're constraining it against your future self. And that's only true when you have a rights tracking understanding of freedom. Very few people have an interest tracking understanding of freedom, where interests are prior to rights. Rights are useful insofar as more often than not, they coincide with things that will further your interest over the course of your life. So we can't entirely, like I said, we can't entirely collapse the legalistic constraints of these things and talk about them flippantly in terms of policy making, because the legalistic things predict for certain things that will make rights crucial. But ultimately, in the ultimate sense, just as goodness is prior to rightness, I would argue, and the prevention of badness at a higher magnitude is more worthy of being prevented than the prevention of wrongness at a lower magnitude. These are all just different ways of saying that the furtherance of an individual's interest is more important than the protection of their rights, when the only way to further their interests is to break their rights at the given moment. And so one example that I just can't believe that I have this simple issue that I can solve for myself, and it's been 6 months now, and I haven't solved it for myself. So about 6 months ago, I bought this pair of shoes. They're fantastic shoes, and I've been walking a lot of long distances over the last 6 months. I'll get into why in a different video, but it's really increased the quality of my 2021. Far better than any year prior to that I can remember. 2021 has been sort of outstanding because I allow myself one day of the week to just go for these long distance walks. It can be 4 hours, maybe 5 hours sometimes, and a lot of music listening. But that's really neither here nor there for the purposes of the point I'm trying to get to. This is relevant for other kinds of non-lengthy walks as well, like if I'm rushing and I'm trying to get to the train in time because I need to commute to work. And so I have these shoes, and the thing is, they came with these roundish shoelaces. I don't understand why shoelaces come in this form, because for those of you who might be speed walkers, you'll already probably know what I'm talking about. Roundish shoelaces, especially when you speed walk, they tend to come undone very easily. Whereas the flat ones, you don't even need to tie them that stringently. If you tie them even with a modest amount of force, they're not going to come undone. But if they're round, or even just roundish, they tend to come undone a lot easily. And so if I'm going for one of my lengthy walks, well, that usually just means that, well, probably in the course of that walk, if it's over 4 hours long, I'll stop and I'll have to retie my shoelaces something in the neighborhood of close to 5, 6, 7 times. And the speedier I walk, the more likely it is that I'm going to have to stop more and more frequently to retie them, the shoelaces. And so you make it seem like, well, that's just whatever. How is that relevant? Well, it's relevant if I need to get somewhere and I need to catch the train. This has actually happened a few times now, where precisely because I stopped and I had to tie them, I missed a train just in the nick of time. The next train was delayed significantly, and I ended up being late, and it just caused a lot of headaches, where none of those headaches had to have been caused if I had just, during these 6 months in which I've had these shoes, every day when I got back and I was frustrated at what happened, every single day I had an opportunity to switch the shoelaces. Because, well, I have spare flat shoelaces. I have ample amounts of them at home. And so as I'm stopping when I'm out on the street, and as I'm stopping repeatedly and tying them and wasting my time, and then even being like 9 out of 10 or maybe 10 out of 10 level frustrated when that sort of stop takes up just enough seconds for me to miss the train and then have the next train be delayed. Like, I'm furious about these sorts of things. Then I say, okay, no more fucking around. The moment you get back home, you get out your spare shoelaces and you switch these roundish ones with the flat ones so that this kind of crap doesn't happen. Implications for that, implications for the long walks, just having to stop just over and over. It just gets extremely tiring. And so even though, every fiber of my being knows that it would be more rational for me to just go ahead and do that. For whatever reason, when I'm back home, I either forget about it, or if I remember it, I tell myself over and over as I'm taking my shoes off, I just need to crash on the couch for a few minutes or maybe a few hours, and then I'm just so exhausted, and then I'll do it, right? But see, what it is I'm just avoiding it because the process of flipping the shoelaces is an unpleasant process. And so I just come up with these excuses like, not now, in a few minutes. I'm too exhausted to do it now. If my ideally rational self, who understands the behavioral implications of being ideally rational in the present moment more forcefully than I understand it, if they were actually around and put a gun to my head and said, you're going to do this right now, because if you don't do it right now, the problem is just going to end up being prolonged because you're not going to do it later. If they did that to me, I understand that whatever kind of slight disturbance I might have, that I'm being forced to do something by some force that doesn't feel like it's coming from my inner will, right? So it's not my volition. Whatever that kind of non-volitional eek thing that we all have when we're forced to do something we don't want to do, would be completely trumped by the fact that, well, I'm not going to have the shoelace problem anymore. And there's a number of these seemingly trivial things that impact a lot of people that really the only way that it can be solved is through a non-volitional solution, through a mechanism like one's ideally rational self having ownership of one's non-ideally rational self. So that the future-present distinction within persons, it's still the same person. There's just different temporal points. Indulge me just one more thing, because I said at some point, it's far more often the case that the bureaucrat, whether elected or not, any kind of government official, is not going to be as well versed about your global preferences as you are. So even though you might not be exactly in the hotspot for being able to plan your life around them and actually have the will to act on them day to day, you're not going to be right at the hotspot, but you're going to be warmer than the average elected or unelected government official will. I said that at some point, and that is true insofar as what we're talking about is your own isolated good. But the moment we move from that and we start talking about anything that slightly resembles a collective action problem, which has many forms, we talk about prisoners' dilemmas, Nash equilibrium, tragedy of the commons, something that's actually entered common parlance, probably the most well-known type of collective action problem, then it's not nearly as clear that the individual is going to be better versed than whoever might have been set up to resolve such problems, whether that's going to be a NGO or a department of government that's referred to as the Department of the Resolution to Collective Action Problems. As far as I know, no such department exists. You have departments that kind of in passing try to solve that, but I think it would be interesting if we actually devoted a department purely to that, and so that we could actually have specialists. You probably employ a lot of people in the way of behavioral psychologists to actually be the advisors to the bureaucrats who would work for one such hypothetical department. So the main point is that it is true when the good is a kind of aim-given good of the individual, though the individual is not going to be perfectly knowledgeable about what the right thing to do is for their global preferences to be actualized, they're probably better situated than the stranger, whether that's a government bureaucrat or some other kind of excessively meddlesome family member. It is true, based on what I've read, that the individual is going to be closer to that than the other. But that's when the good is an isolated good. The moment we're dealing with something like cooperators and defectors, not just reaching your goal by looking at what you do, but also having to reach your goal by looking at what other agents are doing or not doing. Things in the way of conflict resolution, like deterrence theory, is really what went wrong in the Cold War, probably beyond any other kind of thing that went wrong, is both sides operated on the grounds of deterrence theory, which says in any kind of situation of conflict, what you want to do is show a willingness to use excessive force and all these kinds of gestures of strength to deter the other side from taking any kind of preemptive strike against you. And of course, both sides thought that way, and so what they did on their own interpretation as a sign of force, so as to deter the initiation of force by the other side, that was perceived by the other side as an inclination toward a willingness to use preemptive force. And so that's how you had the brinkmanship flare up. And so that's a very difficult issue to solve because we need transnational organizations, because that's, well, the example is the Cold War. But in these domestic situations, you can certainly see how those kinds of collective action problems, where based on how many cooperators do you have versus defectors, that's going to impact how rational you are as a navigator of those kinds of collective action problems. And in those cases, at least if we had a department that had advisors who specialize in this, who comprise the scholarship when it comes to these kinds of issues. There's been tons of oceans of ink that have been spilled on trying to grapple with this. Hell, half of decision theory is devoted precisely to this and intersects with game theory, which themselves are kind of an intersection of psychology and economics. In those cases, we should be all the more eager to export some of that decision procedural difficulty to other exports and have them, through some sort of nudges, impact our behavior. But certainly when it comes to purely isolated goods, I'm not seeing much in the way of hope that some third party can be the final arbiter and the final kind of nudger toward better outcomes for individuals. It's just in those cases where the good truly is an isolated good, the fruits of which will only bear on the individual, I don't think it's something that we can solve collectively. Collective action problems, though, absolutely can, because they are, like the term says, collective action problems. And so I just have to point that out.